Welcome to Roadshow Home Video. Before the movie, we'd like to show you previews of some of our films.
Welcome to A Dingo Ate My Movie, a podcast featuring the weird and wonderful Australian exploitation, or should I say, Ozploitation movies from the 70s, 80s and beyond. My name is Pete, and I'm your host. In this episode 0, we're going to talk about what brought me here, what, in a nutshell, Ozploitation is, and just some general info on what to expect from the podcast in the future. So let's start with the most obvious question. What is Ozploitation? Well, Ozploitation is a category of movies from Australia, generally produced in the 70s and 80s. And this period is essentially known as the golden era of Ozploitation. We do have movies more recently, in later years, that we would count as Ozploitation, I guess, and we'll cover those as well. Ozploitation covers quite a few genres, including sexploitation and comedy, so things like Alvin Purple, The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie, etc. We have a lot of horror, so we're looking at things like Next of Kin, Patrick, The Loved Ones, things like that. And then, of course, we've got biker and action films. So we've got Stone, Mad Max, The Man from Hong Kong, all those sort of, action movies that were made during this time as well. Ozploitation movies were born from societal changes in the 70s, both culturally and politically. Everything from the rise of feminism, the war in Vietnam, and general activism.
The late 60s and then the early 70s was a seismic moment in Australia culturally and politically.
People didn't want to be controlled by governments and by the status quo.
The whole world is in a desperate situation, and we can't afford to sit with our hands folded anymore.
Feminism was just beginning to fracture the relationships between men and women.
Germaine Greer writes, women should seek a revolution.
There was a lot of opposition to the war.
It was unbelievable to live in a society where they were conscripting with a lottery.
We were involved in the moratorium.
Apartheid.
Standing up and saying things about abortion.
Nuclear disarmament.
We felt we were part of a rebellion that was starting worldwide.
We certainly had the ideas that we could change everything.
And you could do that as well as getting stone out of your mind.
There was a young aristocracy which were ruling things and preferring fornication and hallucination to what had preceded.
If you weren't wild, you weren't hip.
There was a tremendous energy, and that carried over into the arts generally.
I never thought that Australia was a place that needed culture of any description. But we did feel we had to have it, as we had to have an opera house, something to put on the stamps. And slowly, of course, it began to grow, and it only really grows on decaying things, because culture is, after all, cheese, isn't it? Or yogurt.
Prior to the early 70s, there wasn't a really big film industry in Australia at all. Things changed a lot in the early 70s when the Australian government took an interest in the arts and established government-funded programs that made it possible for Australian filmmakers to share their visions with the general public.
We were really very lucky that we had at the right time, at the right place, two people who were deeply committed to the idea of an Australian film culture.
If you could show a hint of creative ability in Australia, suddenly you were being lavishly funded.
The government's shelling out piles of bloody moolah for any bastard who reckons he can paint pictures, write poems and make films.
And the whole thing took
Along
off.
with this, we had the R certificate introduced into Australia in 1971. The R rating was one of the 4 new classifications to come into effect in Australia at this time. So we have G, which was, of course, general exhibition, NRC, not recommended for children, M for mature audiences, and R, which was restricted to audiences 18 and over. These more liberal attitudes to sex, nudity, and violence was the catalyst for the Ozploitation genre in Australia for many years to come.
Australian censorship was the most repressive anywhere in the Western world.
If you happen to see breasts bare, and certainly if you saw pubic hair, you'd just about fall out of your seat.
We had in Australia in those days a censor, a man called Prowse. I didn't know anything about him much, except that he had one arm.
Prowse couldn't masturbate as easily as perhaps others could. And when I was involved in censorship rousing, Barry Humphries would throw press conferences and say,
I was sorry Mr. Prowse couldn't attend, but I had heard that he would have given his right arm to be there.
I think it was the advent of Don Shipp as Minister for Customs that led to some slackening of the censorship law.
I think community standards change and the censorship philosophies follow it.
He pioneered the R certificate.
The R rating allowed much more explicit violence and much more explicit sex.
And suddenly it was on for young and old.
The term Ozploitation was first coined by director Mark Hartley in his excellent documentary, Not Quite Hollywood, The Wild Untold Story of Ozploitation from 2008. In this documentary, Quentin Tarantino, himself a big fan of Australian exploitation films, coined the term Ozploitation, which Mark Hartley shortened to Ozploitation, and that's pretty much what we have now and how it came to be.
There was just this certain flavour about the Aussie exploitation. I call it Ozploitation.
Weird, wonderful, really strange movies.
Down and dirty.
Very fast and cheap.
Urban vulgarity. Bad language.
Cop that, you rotten pommy bastard.
Something's gonna blow up.
Sexual overtones.
Aussie bullies terrorising people.
Murder, rape, and mayhem.
Thriller, chiller.
Slash and cut and kill.
Bad advertisements for Australia.
Most of the Australian genre films were actually released in America, all right, through exploitation houses and stuff. And it was actually coinciding with the whole big Australian boom, the big Australian new wave that was coming out with My Brilliant Career and The Getting of Wisdom and Breaking Morant and all those movies. Now, when those movies were coming out, they were like, the new Australian film, Australian cinema, Australian cinema, Australian cinema. That was like the key word for independent cinema. But the Australian genre films weren't being touted as Aussie films. I didn't know they were Aussie genre films until I bought my ticket and they opened their mouth.
Some of the movies we'll be covering in the podcast, we're going to kick off during March with The Man from Hong Kong, which I'm really looking forward to doing. That's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be doing things like Wake in Fright. We'll do Stone. We'll do The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie, Dead End Drive-In, Stalk, Razorback, Next of Kin, Road Games, Turkey Shoot, etc., etc. There's a pile of movies that we will be able to go through. The format we're going to cover with the podcast, we're pretty much, I'm not going to talk on my own, right? I'm not big on talking on my own for, an hour or 30 minutes even, just listening to my own voice. So I'm going to have guests as much as possible. Hopefully every episode will have guests. And with those guests, we'll talk about the movie in general, our thoughts. I have a lot of friends outside the country in the US, most notably, that I've made through the horror community. So I'd like to get some of those guys on. I'm really keen to see what they think of these movies and how they see them culturally within their own country. So while I still want to have Australian people on the show, which would be great, I'd be really happy to just have people from in other places and introduce them to these movies. I'm no expert in these movies. I'm not going to put myself out there as an expert in these movies. I've liked them and loved them for a long time, but I'll be, a lot of these movies I'll be seeing for the first time as well, so I'm really looking forward to that. Things like Mad Dog Morgan, believe it or not, I've never seen it, so I'm really looking forward to catching up with movies like that, talking about those movies with our guests.
Ha-ha! Boomerang!
What next? A corroboree?
You could have been shot.
Shot be damned. I'm the magistrate of Wagga Wagga.
Of course, one of the things I want to emphasize is I really love to get feedback from everybody in regards to what they would like to hear on the show, what they would like to, what movies I would love us to talk about. If they're interested in being on a show, I'd absolutely love to hear about it. So you can get me pretty much everywhere. So I'm on Twitter as at Dingo Movie, or you can find me at Peter Icono. We're on Instagram, Dingo Movie Pod. I'm on Facebook at Dingo Movie Pod, I think the same. And of course, you can email me at pete@dingomoviepod.com. So that pretty much wraps it up for this very short episode, for our first episode. Thank you very much for listening. It's been quite a journey to get here, and it's going to be interesting seeing how things go over the next, months, years, hopefully. We'll see how things go. At the end of this episode, after all this little spiel bit, I'm putting the full version of the music that is heard at the start of the episode. I spent ages, probably way too long, recording that, but it was kind of fun. And so instead of just hearing, a bit of it at the start, I thought just for this episode, I'd put it all at the end. So I'd love to hear what you think of that. I'm just a drummer that plays with loops, so hopefully it sounds okay. And thanks very much. All right, until we see you with our first proper episode, thank you very much, and have fun. See you guys later. Bye.
A videotape that wasn't quite right? It may have been a pirate copy.
Chain in those handcuffs. It's high tensile steel. It'll take you 10 minutes to hack through it with this. Now, if you're lucky,